Imagine boarding a plane and being judged solely for the hat you're wearing. What if the person everyone is whispering about turns out to be a hero? This story will make you question everything you think you know about appearances and assumptions. The airplane cabin buzzed with activity as passengers boarded, searching for their seats and settling in. Among them was a man in his late 50s, quietly making his way down the aisle. His red MAGA cap caught the attention of everyone he passed. Whispers began to ripple through. The rows? Seriously, who still wears that? A passenger muttered under their breath. Others exchanged judgmental glances, and some outright stared, their disapproval written all over their faces. The man kept his head down, his weathered hands gripping a small duffel bag. He didn't respond to the whispers or the scoffs, as if he'd grown used to reactions like these. Reaching his seat, he placed his bag in the overhead compartment and sat by the window, staring out at the tarmac. The noise around him didn't seem to bother him, but it was only the beginning. Unbeknownst to everyone on board, this unassuming passenger carried a story that would change the atmosphere of the flight in ways no one could have predicted. As the passengers settled into their seats, the flight attendants began their rounds. One by one, they checked seatbelts, directed late arrivals, and exchanged polite smiles, until they reached the man. In the red MAGA cap, one of the flight attendants, a young woman with a polished uniform and an air of authority, paused briefly when she saw him. Her professional smile faltered, replaced by a stiff expression. "Sir, your bag is sticking out of the compartment. You'll need to adjust it," she said curtly, her tone colder than necessary. The man nodded politely and stood to fix it. But as he did, she sighed loudly, rolling her eyes as if dealing with him was an inconvenience. Other passengers noticed her demeanor, some smirking as if they shared her sentiment. Later, when the drink service began, the same attendant approached his row. "What do you want to drink?" she asked flatly, barely meeting his gaze. "Just water, please," the man replied calmly. Her response was swift and sharp. "We don't have bottled water. You'll have to wait for the tap." She moved on before he could reply, pouring drinks for the next row with a cheerful smile that contrasted sharply with her earlier tone. The man adjusted in his seat, his face still calm, but his hands betrayed a slight tremble. The whispers from the passengers behind him hadn't stopped. The judgment in the air was suffocating, but he said nothing. Little did the crew and passengers know their assumptions about this man would soon be shattered. The flight continued, but the air around the man with the red MAGA cap felt heavier with each passing minute. Every subtle glance, whispered comment and smirk seemed aimed directly at him. Though he sat quietly, the tension was palpable, and it was clear he was being singled out, not just by the passengers, but by the crew as well. It all started when he politely raised his hand to get the attention of a passing flight attendant. She hesitated, pretending not to see him at first, but eventually turned, her demeanor cold and impatient. "Yes?" she said curtly, crossing her arms. "Sorry to bother." "You, ma'am, could I please have a napkin?" he asked with a calm voice, his tone unwavering despite her visible irritation. Her response was loud, sharp, and designed to humiliate. "Didn't I just pass through here? Maybe you should have asked then," she snapped, the edge in her voice drawing the attention of nearby passengers. The cabin fell silent for a brief moment as passengers exchanged knowing glances. Someone in the back let out a low chuckle, and a woman in the row across muttered, "Figures." The man lowered his gaze, his weathered hands gripping the armrest tightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly, his voice almost drowned out by the noise of the plane. But the flight attendant wasn't finished. "You're not the only passenger here, you know," she added sharply, before walking away without another word, leaving him sitting there with an empty drink cup in his hand. And no napkin. Around him, some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly sensing the unfairness of the situation. But no one said a word. The murmurs continued, with comments like, "Well, what do you expect? And that hat says everything about him." It wasn't just the passengers who joined in the silent judgment. Another flight attendant passed by his row moments later, and though she didn't say anything directly, her dismissive glance and exaggerated smile to the next passenger spoke volumes. The man sat in silence, staring out the window, his face expressionless, but his hands resting on his lap betrayed a slight tremble. He didn't argue, didn't react. It was as if he had endured this kind of treatment before. For a moment it seemed as though the entire plane was united in their disdain for this one man, except for a few passengers who watched in quiet discomfort, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Then something unexpected happened. The cockpit door opened and the pilot stepped out. His eyes scanned the cabin with a calm yet firm expression, his presence commanding immediate attention. He looked toward the back of the plane, locking eyes briefly with the man in the red cap. The murmurs stopped, replaced by a quiet tension. Something big was about to happen, and no one was prepared for what the pilot was about to reveal. The cabin grew quiet as the pilot walked purposefully down the aisle, his sharp uniform and confident stride drawing every pair of eyes in the room. Passengers whispered among themselves, unsure of what was about to unfold. Some assumed he was addressing a technical issue. Others thought it might involve the man in the red cap. The pilot stopped near the man's row, his expression serious but calm. He glanced briefly at the flight attendants, who suddenly seemed to shrink under his gaze, their earlier confidence evaporating. Clearing his throat, the pilot turned to address the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and authoritative, "I feel compelled to share something important with you all." The passengers leaned in, curious and slightly apprehensive. "This man here," the pilot continued, gesturing toward the quiet passenger in the red cap, "has faced more than just judgment on this flight, and while some of you may have formed opinions about him based on what he's wearing, let me tell you who he really is." The man looked up, visibly startled. His eyes met the pilot's, filled with confusion and a hint of vulnerability. "This man is a retired firefighter," the pilot said, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. "He served for over 25 years, risking his life countless times to save others. In fact, he was one of the first responders during a devastating building fire that claimed many lives. But thanks to him, dozens walked away alive, including someone very dear to me." A wave of stunned silence swept through the cabin. The judgmental smirks and condescending glances disappeared, replaced by wide eyes and open mouths. The pilot continued, his voice filled with emotion. 20 years ago, during one of the worst fires my hometown had ever seen, this man saved my father's life. If it weren't for his courage, I wouldn't be standing here today." The man in the red cap shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unused to such public recognition. His hands trembled and his face flushed with emotion. The passengers, many of whom had looked down on him moments before, now looked at him with a mix of guilt and awe. A few began to clap hesitantly, but soon the applause spread throughout the plane, echoing off the walls of the cabin. The flight attendants who had treated him with disdain earlier now stood frozen, their faces pale with embarrassment. One of them even muttered a soft apology under her breath. The pilot placed a hand on the man's shoulder and said, "Thank you for your service. You are a hero, and it's an honor to have you on this flight." The man nodded, his voice thick with emotion as he finally spoke. "I was just doing my job," he said humbly. But for everyone on board, it was clear that this quiet, unassuming man was far more than his hat or his appearance. The applause echoed through the cabin, growing louder as more passengers joined in. What had started as a flight filled with judgment and prejudice had transformed into a moment of unity and respect. The man in the red cap sat quietly, his head slightly bowed, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of gratitude. Some passengers looked visibly ashamed, their earlier whispers and judgmental glances now haunting them. A woman across the aisle leaned over and said softly, "I'm so sorry for the way you've been treated. Thank you for everything you've done." Others followed her lead, offering quiet apologies and words of thanks. Even the flight attendants, who had been so cold and dismissive, approached him with contrite expressions. The one who had snapped at him earlier handed him a fresh drink and napkin, her voice trembling as she said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." The man looked up, his face lined with years of experience, but softened by humility. "It's okay," he said gently. "Sometimes people don't know the full story. I'm not here to judge anyone." His words hung in the air, carrying a weight that made everyone pause. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely shifted. It was no longer filled with whispers and judgment, but with respect and reflection. The pilot returned to the cockpit, but his announcement lingered in everyone's minds. The rest of the flight passed in a contemplative silence, broken occasionally by quiet conversations about how appearances can be deceiving. As the plane landed and passengers prepared to disembark, many paused to thank the man again, some even shaking his hand. For some, it was a moment of gratitude. For others, it was an opportunity to make amends. But as the man stood to leave, one final interaction captured the heart of the entire flight. A young boy approached him, tugging at his mother's hand. "Are you really a hero?" the boy asked, his wide eyes filled with admiration. The man smiled warmly, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "No," he said softly. "I'm just someone who wanted to help." The simplicity of his answer brought tears to the eyes of several passengers, including the boy's mother. As he exited the plane, the applause erupted once more, this time carrying an unmistakable tone of respect and gratitude. This story is a powerful reminder that we often judge others without knowing their journey. It challenges us to look beyond appearances and treat everyone with kindness, for we never know the battles they've fought or the lives they've touched. What do you think? Have you ever judged someone too quickly? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and make you reflect. See you next time.